The Guadalcanal Campaign concluded with a decisive strategic victory for the Allies. American forces successfully defended Henderson Field, repelled major Japanese assaults, and ultimately forced their withdrawal from the island in a state of utter exhaustion. August 21st, 1942, 01:30 hours, near the Ilu River, Guadalcanal. The humid night air, thick with the scent of decay and swamp water, is suddenly torn apart by the metallic chatter of Nambu Type 92 machine guns. Muzzle flashes strobe across the sandbar at the mouth of what the Marines call Alligator Creek, illuminating waves of charging soldiers from Colonel Kayonao Ichiki's 1st Element. They are veterans, hardened by campaigns in China, and they move with a terrifying purpose, their bayonets fixed and gleaming. They believe in the supremacy of their warrior spirit, Yamato Damashi, a force that has overcome every obstacle from Manchuria to Singapore. Tonight, they expect to annihilate the green American soldiers who have dared to seize this godforsaken island. For the young Marines of Colonel Clifton B. Cates's 1st Marine Regiment, dug in on the West Bank, this is the first real test. They've heard the stories, seen the newsreels of the unstoppable Japanese advance across the Pacific. Now that seemingly invincible army is screaming towards them out of the darkness. A green flare arcs overhead, a signal for the main assault. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers surge forward, a living tide of infantry expecting to overwhelm the defenders through sheer ferocity and numbers. They have been taught that the Americans are soft, individualistic, and will break under the pressure of a determined night attack. But something is wrong. The American response is not the scattered, panicked rifle fire the Japanese have been conditioned to expect. Instead, the sandbar erupts in a coordinated storm of machine gun fire. The sound is different, a deeper, more sustained roar. Water-cooled M1917A1 Browning machine guns, firing at a steady 600 rounds per minute, scythe through the charging ranks. Tracer rounds crisscross the darkness, creating a horrific lattice of light that catches the Japanese soldiers in its web. Alongside the machine guns, 37mm anti-tank guns, loaded with canister shot, blast football field-sized swathes of the sandbar with hundreds of .30 caliber steel balls per round. The first wave of Ichiki's proud veterans vanishes, cut down in an instant. The men behind them falter, stumbling over the bodies of their comrades. Still, they press on, driven by their orders and a rigid code of honor that forbids retreat. A handful of soldiers, driven by sheer momentum and courage, manage to breach the American wire and engage in brutal hand-to-hand combat, briefly capturing a few forward positions before a Marine Reserve Company counterattacks and annihilates them. Another company attempts to outflank the Marines by charging through the ocean surf, only to be systematically ripped apart by machine gun crews who traverse their guns into the waves. The tide, stained red, deposits their bodies back onto the sand. For the Japanese soldiers who survived the initial onslaught, a terrifying realization begins to dawn. This is not a battle of spirit. This is a battle against a machine. The American guns do not stop. When one Browning overheats, the crew calmly pours water from their canteens into its jacket and resumes firing. Ammunition seems to materialize out of the darkness. The sheer volume of fire is something they have never encountered. It is relentless, impersonal, and utterly overwhelming. Their own Nambu machine guns, while effective, cannot match the sustained, murderous output of the American weapons. Their mortars land, but are quickly answered by a seemingly endless barrage from the Marine positions. For every round they fire, 10 come back. The psychological impact is as devastating as the physical one. The belief in their own superiority, the very foundation of their fighting doctrine, is being shredded by a hailstorm of American lead. The sandbar at Alligator Creek is no longer a battlefield. It has become an industrial killing zone. The lull is deceptive, a brief ringing silence where the thunder of machine guns had been. For the surviving soldiers of the Ichiki detachment, huddled in shallow scrapes in the sand or pressed against the bank of the creek, the silence is more terrifying than the noise. It gives them a moment to comprehend the sheer scale of the slaughter. Whole platoons have ceased to exist. The path of their charge is now a carpet of dead and dying men, their bodies contorted in the flickering light of a burning ammunition crate. From his forward command post, Colonel Ichiki stares in disbelief. His plan was sound, based on a doctrine that had shattered British, Dutch, and American forces across the Pacific. A swift, decisive night assault, bayonet over bullet, spirit over steel. But the Americans had not broken. They had not even bent. They had simply fed their machine guns, belt after belt, and erased his elite first wave. On the American side of the Ilu, there is no sense of victory, only grim, methodical work. Runners move along the line, distributing ammunition cans that feel impossibly heavy. More 30 cal for gun 4. A sergeant barks, his voice hoarse. Keep those water jackets topped off. Young Marines, their faces smeared with grime and sweat, pry open wooden crates of ammunition with their K-bars. The sound of splintering wood, a small domestic noise in the symphony of war. This is the American way of war, a concept the Japanese soldiers pinned down across the creek cannot possibly fathom. It is a war of logistics, of production, of an endless supply chain stretching 7,000 miles back to the factories of Detroit and Pittsburgh. For every belt of ammunition fired, 100 more are waiting in the division's supply dump. For every artillery shell sent screaming into the darkness, 1,000 more lie stacked in the holds of transport ships. The individual Marine is brave, but his true strength lies in the knowledge that he is the tip of an industrial spear of unimaginable length and weight. Just before the first hints of dawn streak the eastern sky, Ichiki makes his final fatal decision. He cannot accept defeat. To retreat would be the ultimate shame, a stain on the honor of his regiment and his emperor. He gathers his remaining officers and issues a simple, brutal order, a final, all-out frontal assault. There is no subtlety, no attempt to flank. It is a desperate, suicidal gamble, a belief that one last, pure expression of the Japanese fighting spirit can overcome the mechanical monster waiting for them. As bugles sound a wavering, defiant call, the survivors of the detachment rise as one. With cries of Tenoheika Banzai, long live His Majesty the Emperor, they fix bayonets and charge once more into the meat grinder. This time, the American response is even more devastating. The gunners, now intimately familiar with every inch of the sandbar, do not waste a single round. But a new sound joins the chorus. From positions further back, the 75mm and 105mm howitzers of the 11th Marines open up. The artillerymen had spent the night registering their guns on the creek mouth, and now they unleash hell. High explosive shells walk across the sandbar, throwing geysers of sand, shrapnel, and human bodies into the air. The Japanese charge dissolves before it can even gain momentum. Men are not just shot. They are vaporized, their bodies torn to pieces by the concussive blasts. A Japanese soldier who had survived the machine guns now finds himself in a new kind of nightmare. The earth erupts around him. He can't see the enemy, can't fight him. He can only cower as the sky falls, each explosion a hammer blow from an angry god. His Arisaka rifle, a symbol of his martial pride, is useless. He is no longer a soldier, he is merely a target. The concept of an enemy with seemingly limitless artillery willing to expend thousands of shells on a few hundred infantrymen is not just militarily confounding, it is spiritually crushing. It suggests that his life, his sacrifice, is of no consequence to this new, indifferent American war machine. August 21st, 1942, 0500 hours. The tropical dawn breaks with a cruel, impartial light, revealing the full extent of the carnage. To the Marines on the western bank of Alligator Creek, the sight is both sickening and surreal. The sandbar is no longer sand. It is a macabre tapestry woven from the bodies of nearly 800 Japanese soldiers. The tide pools are stained crimson. Equipment lies scattered everywhere, rifles, helmets, Nambu machine guns now silent, their crews lying motionless around them. The night's desperate, screaming charges have given way to an eerie quiet, punctuated only by the groans of the wounded and the buzz of flies already gathering in the oppressive heat. There is a sense of awe among the defenders. They have not just repelled an attack, they have witnessed the systematic annihilation of a famed enemy unit by the sheer brute force of their firepower. For the handful of Japanese soldiers still alive on the east bank, trapped in a small coconut grove between the creek and the sea, dawn brings no hope. It only brings clarity. Colonel Ichiki, his uniform torn and his face a mask of ash and despair, now understands the terrible truth. His warrior spirit, his Yamato Damashi, had been irrelevant. He had brought a sword to a gunfight of industrial proportions. He had charged into the teeth of a machine designed for the express purpose of mass-producing death, and the machine had not even flinched. His men, the victors of a dozen campaigns, had been reduced to mere grist for that mill. They were cut off, their backs to the Pacific, with no hope of reinforcement or escape. The Americans, however, are not content to wait. This is not Bushido, this is total war. General Vandergrift is not interested in an honorable stalemate. He wants the threat eliminated. The order is given to encircle and destroy the remaining Japanese forces. The 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, begins to move, crossing the creek upstream to cut off any path of retreat. As they advance, they are preceded by a rolling barrage from the 11th Marines artillery. The shelling is no longer just defensive, it is a tool of extermination, methodically ploughing the ground, splintering coconut trees, and suppressing any organized resistance. Then comes a new sound, a low, rumbling clatter that sends a fresh wave of dread through the beleaguered Japanese survivors. 5 M3 Stuart light tanks of the 1st Tank Battalion emerge from the American lines, their tracks churning the sand. To a Japanese soldier, armed with a bolt-action rifle and a bayonet, a tank is a monster from another world. The Stuarts advance into the grove, their machine guns chattering, their 37mm cannons firing canister shot into any pocket of resistance. The Japanese have no anti-tank weapons. They try to swarm the vehicles, attempting to jam rifles into the treads or climb aboard to attack the vision slits with their bayonets. They are gunned down without ceremony. One soldier, clutching a magnetic mine, makes a desperate run at the lead tank, only to be cut in half by a burst of .30 caliber fire from a supporting infantry squad. From his makeshift command post, watching his last men being hunted down by armor and incinerated by artillery, Colonel Ichiki performs the final act of a man whose entire worldview has been shattered. He retrieves the regimental colors, the sacred symbol of his unit's honor. He cannot allow them to fall into enemy hands. After ensuring their destruction, he kneels, draws his ceremonial pistol, and ends his own life. His suicide is not just an act of desperation, but a final, silent admission that the principles he had lived and fought for were meaningless in the face of this new American warfare. He and his men were not defeated by better soldiers. They were rendered obsolete by a better system of logistics and production. They had prepared for a war of spirit and found themselves in a war of supply. For the U.S. Marines, the battle is a sobering confirmation of their own industrial might, but also a chilling preview of the fanatical, no-surrender fighting that will define the Pacific War. September 7, 1942. Aboard the deck of the Japanese destroyer Kagero, the vessel slices through the dark, placid waters of the Slot, part of the near-nightly Tokyo Express run, ferrying troops and supplies to the starving Japanese garrison on Guadalcanal. On deck, crammed shoulder to shoulder, are the soldiers of Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi's 35th Infantry Brigade. They are fresh, confident, and eager for battle. They have heard about the disaster that befell Ichiki's detachment, but the stories are dismissed as cautionary tales of recklessness. Ichiki, they whisper, was arrogant. He underestimated the enemy and attacked without proper reconnaissance. They, the Kawaguchi Brigade, will not make the same mistake. They are the main body, a force of over 6,000 elite soldiers, and they will succeed where Ichiki's small first element failed. They will march inland, circle south of the American-held airfield, and attack the soft underbelly of the marine perimeter. Their confidence begins to erode the moment they step ashore at Tasimboko Point, well east of the American lines. The first shock is the sheer lack of infrastructure. There are no docks, no cranes, no waiting trucks. Supplies are manhandled off the destroyers, through the surf and onto the beach. Every bag of rice, every box of 7.7mm ammunition, every 75mm artillery shell, which has to be broken down into 3 separate, crushingly heavy loads, must be carried on the backs of the soldiers themselves. The Tokyo Express cannot linger. It must be gone before the American Cactus Air Force at Henderson Field wakes at dawn. What cannot be moved inland quickly must be hidden in shallow caches in the jungle, vulnerable to air attack and the rotting damp. The march itself is a descent into a green hell. The plan, so clear on a map in Rabaul, is a nightmare on the ground. The jungle is a living entity, an enemy as formidable as the Marines. Towering trees create a suffocating canopy that traps the heat and humidity, while the ground is a treacherous web of roots, vines, and sucking mud. Men sink to their knees in unseen bogs. They use their bayonets to hack through the relentless vegetation, a process that exhausts them within the first hour of a 12-hour march. Their rations are meager from the starter ball of rice, a few pickled plums. Within days, dysentery and malaria begin to ravage the ranks. Men fall out of the line of march, their faces pale with fever, and are simply left behind to die. As they claw their way south, they begin to hear it. At first, it's a distant, intermittent rumble, easily mistaken for thunder. But as they draw nearer to the southern edge of the marine perimeter, the sound becomes more defined. It is the sound of artillery, not a frantic barrage, but a slow, methodical, almost lazy pounding. Boom, a pause, boom. The Japanese veterans are confused. This is not the sound of a battle in progress. This is H&I, fire harassment, and interdiction. The Americans are simply firing shells into the jungle at random map coordinates, day and night, for no other reason than that they can. They are shooting at ghosts, at the mere possibility of a Japanese presence. To a soldier from the Imperial Japanese Army, where every shell is precious and accounted for, this casual display of raw power is incomprehensible. It speaks of a bottomless well of supply. It is the sound of a nation that does not need to conserve, a nation that can afford to pave the jungle with high explosives on the off chance of hitting something. The psychological impact is profound. Long before they see a single Marine, the soldiers of the Kawaguchi Brigade are being worn down by the sheer industrial noise of their enemy. The sound whispers a terrifying message through the trees: we have so much, we can afford to waste it. How much do you have? September 12, 1942, 21:30 hours, a grassy ridge 1 mile south of Henderson Field. The men of the 1st Marine Raider Battalion, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Merritt, Red Mike Edson, lie waiting in their foxholes. They are exhausted, running on coffee and nervous energy, having been on the front line for weeks. This ridge, a natural avenue of approach from the south, is the designated weak point General Kawaguchi has spent weeks maneuvering his brigade to attack. The Marines can hear them now. A faint rustling in the kunai grass below the ridge, the occasional clink of a rifle against a helmet. The air is tense, the jungle unnervingly quiet between the booms of the distant H&I shelling. For the Japanese soldiers of the first assault wave, this is the moment of truth. They have endured the march from hell, subsisting on a handful of victory biscuits and raw rice. They are sick, emaciated shadows of the men who landed at Tasimboko, but their spirit remains unbroken. They believe the Americans are decadent and soft, and that a single ferocious charge will shatter their line and deliver the airfield. A red flare hisses into the sky, the signal, a chorus of guttural shouts. Banzai erupts from the darkness as the 1st Battalion of the Kawaguchi Brigade surges from the jungle's edge and up the slope of the ridge. They move with a desperate speed, a wave of bayonets meant to overwhelm the defenders before they can organize. They overrun the forward listening posts, and for a few terrifying moments, it seems their fanatical charge will succeed. They are fighting with a ferocity the raiders have never witnessed. But this ridge is not just defended by rifles and bayonets. It is the anvil upon which a hammer of American industrial might is about to fall. As the first wave of Japanese soldiers breaks cover, the ridge explodes. It begins with the mortars, nests of 60mm and 81mm mortars, their tubes pre-aimed at likely avenues of approach, begin a steady percussive thump, thump, thump. The air fills with the whistle of falling bombs that detonate among the charging Japanese, sending bodies and pieces of bodies flying. The assault wave falters, the men scrambling for cover that doesn't exist. Then the 105mm howitzers of the 5th Battalion, 11th Marines, join the fray. A forward observer in a foxhole with Colonel Edson calmly speaks into a field telephone. Grid 7Z, fire for effect. Miles away, gun crews who will never see the enemy they are killing slide shells into the breeches of their cannons. Seconds later, the entire northern slope of the ridge is engulfed in a rolling barrage of high explosives. The earth heaves, trees are stripped bare and tossed into the air like matchsticks. The concussive blasts are so powerful, they rupture the internal organs of the men caught in the open. For a Japanese soldier crawling through the grass, the experience is apocalyptic. There is no enemy to charge, no foxhole to storm. The very ground he crawls upon is being systematically torn apart by an invisible, omnipotent force. His comrades are simply vaporized in flashes of orange light. The terrifying noise he heard on the jungle trail was just a whisper. This is the full-throated roar. For the men of the Kawaguchi Brigade, the psychological shock is cataclysmic. They were prepared to die bravely in a bayonet charge against an American Marine. They were not prepared to be obliterated by a steel storm summoned from beyond the horizon. Their doctrine, their training, their entire conception of warfare is rendered instantly obsolete. How can spirit triumph against this? How can a bayonet fight an artillery shell? The charge breaks not from a lack of courage, but from a sheer impossibility of purpose. The survivors scramble back into the relative safety of the jungle, leaving hundreds of their dead scattered across the burning slope. They have not been defeated by the Marine raiders. They have been repulsed by the factories of the United States, by a logistical chain that makes ammunition a resource to be expended as freely as water. As they regroup in the darkness, listening to the shells continue to fall, a dreadful new understanding takes root. They are not just fighting an army, they are fighting a country. September 13th, 1942, 2200 hours. The same ridge, now irrevocably christened Bloody Ridge. The air is thick with the metallic smell of blood and cordite. For Major General Kawaguchi, huddled with his staff in the dark jungle, there is no choice. Retreat is unthinkable. He has been given a direct order to capture the airfield, and the honor of his nation is at stake. He believes the Americans are at their breaking point, that their line is thin and their morale shattered. He will throw everything he has left, 2 full battalions and the remnants of the 1st at the ridge in a massive coordinated assault. He will use infiltration tactics, sending skirmishers to probe for weaknesses before the main body charges. This time, he reasons, the sheer weight of numbers and the indomitable Japanese spirit must prevail. He orders his men to fix bayonets one last time. For the Marines on the ridge, the night is a waking nightmare. They haven't slept in over 36 hours. Their original perimeter has been bent and battered, and Edson has pulled his men back to a secondary line, tightening the defense around the critical Hill 123, the last knob of high ground before the airfield itself. They are outnumbered, exhausted, and fighting for their lives. Ammunition is plentiful, but men are not. Every raider, every paramarine, every engineer pressed into the line knows that if this ridge falls, the entire Guadalcanal Campaign falls with it. The Japanese attack begins not with a single banzai charge, but with a terrifying stealth. Infiltrators, their faces blackened with mud, crawl through the tall grass, cutting communication wires and tossing grenades into foxholes. Then the main assault comes, a human wave far larger than the previous nights, crashing against the center and right flank of the Marine line. The fighting immediately devolves into a savage, intimate chaos. It is a desperate melee of bayonets, knives, and fists in the flickering light of flares. A Japanese platoon, using a small draw for cover, breaks through the line, separating 2 Marine companies. For a moment, the entire American position is on the verge of collapse. It is then that the American machine of war, which had merely repulsed the Japanese the night before, is unleashed with its full cataclysmic fury. Colonel Edson, his command post in the thick of the fighting, gets on the radio to the 11th Marines. His request is simple and desperate. He wants the artillery to fire directly on his own position. He is calling for a curtain of steel to be lowered just behind his front-line foxholes, a barrage so close that it will annihilate anything friend or foe that tries to cross it. It is a final, terrifying gamble. The response is instantaneous and awesome. Every single 105mm howitzer available to the 1st Marine Division, more than 40 guns, focuses on the northern slope of Bloody Ridge. The methodical shelling of the previous night becomes a continuous, deafening roar. Shells scream overhead, one after another, landing just a few hundred yards behind the embattled Marine line. The ground shakes so violently that it becomes difficult to stand. The noise is a physical force, a crushing pressure that seems to squeeze the very air from a man's lungs. To the Marines, it is both terrifying and beautiful. They are fighting on the lip of a volcano they have summoned themselves. For the Japanese soldiers pouring over the crest of the ridge, believing they have achieved the breakthrough, this curtain of fire is the end of the world. They are not walking into machine gun fire. They are walking into a solid wall of high explosives and shrapnel. Entire companies are erased in a matter of seconds. Men who had survived the jungle, malaria, and hand-to-hand combat are simply blown to pieces. The relentless, impersonal nature of the barrage is what truly breaks them. There is no honor in being torn apart by an unseen enemy. There is no glory in charging a machine. The final waves of the assault falter, then break completely. The survivors stumbling back into the jungle, their minds shattered by the sheer, overwhelming violence. They had come to fight men, but had found themselves at war with an entire industrial nation, a nation that could afford to fire artillery shells like they were rifle bullets. September the 14th, 1942. Dawn over Bloody Ridge. The sun rises on a scene of utter desolation. The curtain of steel has lifted, leaving behind a silence that is heavier and more profound than the noise it replaced. On the northern slope, the ground is churned into a lunar landscape of overlapping shell craters. The bodies of more than 500 Japanese soldiers lie where they fell, mangled and torn by the night's barrage. To the exhausted Marines peering from their foxholes, it is a ghastly, sobering sight. They have held the line, but they are forever changed by the ferocity of the enemy and the terrifying power of their own weapons. The ridge is theirs, and with it, Henderson Field is secure. The strategic turning point of the Guadalcanal Campaign has been won not by a bayonet, but by the mathematical certainty of artillery tables and an unending supply of high-explosive shells. For the survivors of the Kawaguchi Brigade, the retreat is a death march. They are no longer a fighting force. They are a scattered collection of starving, traumatized men. They stumble back into the jungle, not with the discipline of a planned withdrawal, but with the despair of a shattered army. General Kawaguchi, his grand plan in ruins, leads the remnants on a torturous trek back to the coast. They have no food. They eat roots, snails, and the bark off trees. Men too weak to continue are left to die, a practice that gnaws at the soul of an army built on cohesion and mutual obligation. The spectre of malaria and dysentery claims more men than the battle itself, but it is a deeper wound that festers in their minds. As they stagger through the suffocating green labyrinth, they are haunted by the sound, the incessant thunderous roar of the American artillery. It was a sound that had no counter, a force that could not be fought. It represented a truth they had never been forced to confront, that their martial spirit, their willingness to die, their very identity as superior warriors was irrelevant. They had trained their entire lives for a decisive battle, a clash of wills where courage would be the ultimate arbiter. Instead, they had been subjected to an industrial process of annihilation. They had been treated as little more than a problem to be solved by the application of a sufficient tonnage of explosives. This realization, born in the mud of Guadalcanal, would ripple throughout the Imperial Japanese Army. The soldiers who survived and were evacuated would carry the story with them. They spoke not of the American soldier's weakness, but of his inexhaustible resources. They described machine guns that never seemed to run dry and cannons that fired day and night without concern for the cost. The phrase unlimited ammunition became a grim shorthand for the new reality of the Pacific War. It explained the inexplicable, how their most valiant charges could be erased before they even began, how their courage could be rendered meaningless. This crushing sense of material inferiority would shape the rest of the war. It bred a fanatical, fatalistic mindset. If they could not win a war of logistics, they would win a war of attrition by inflicting unbearable pain. The suicidal banzai charges would continue, but they were no longer born of a belief in victory, but of a desire to take as many of the enemy with them as possible. The kamikaze pilot, the defender of Iwo Jima, digging into his volcanic rock fortress, the Okinawan civilian forced into battle, were downstream from the psychological shock first administered at Guadalcanal. They were the desperate, brutal answers to a question first posed by the thunder of the 105mm howitzers over Bloody Ridge. What do you do when you realize your enemy's spirit is not only as strong as your own, but is backed by a machine that can blot out the sun with steel? For the Japanese soldier, the war was no longer about victory. It was about the nobility of a beautiful, hopeless death against an enemy who possessed, quite simply, everything. The Guadalcanal Campaign concluded with a decisive strategic victory for the Allies. American forces successfully defended Henderson Field, repelled major Japanese assaults, and ultimately forced their withdrawal from the island in a state of utter exhaustion. In my personal assessment, this campaign was not just a military turning point, but also a brutal lesson on the nature of modern warfare. It proved indisputably that fighting spirit and courage, no matter how tenacious, could not overcome the overwhelming power of logistics and industry. Guadalcanal shattered the myth of the Japanese army's invincibility and exposed the truth that victory in the 20th century was decided more by factories than by bayonets.